Hey guys, and welcome back to the Mewsh channel. Today we're going to be doing a little bit of something different, a little something different. We're doing kind of an almost lecture type experience. Um, so I wanted to. This is going to be aimed at newer or intermediate players. We're talking about star economy. This is one of the things that is very important in Chaos Galaxy TCG. It is one of the most interesting and unique parts about the game as a whole. So hopefully, um, if you haven't played the game a lot, this will hopefully give you a really good jumping off point for how a little bit of the intricacies of the game. If you don't know me, I'm Mewsh. I've played my fair share of top cuts over the years. I've been playing maybe 3, almost 4 years now. So I'm not the most qualified on the subject, but I am decent enough, I think. Um, so hopefully you can get something out of this, even if you're pretty experienced. Maybe it'll be fun to get my view on things, get some terminology that maybe we don't all have like unified together. And yeah, so yeah, hopefully we can get all something out of this. There's gonna be a lot being covered, so there will be some timestamps in the description probably. If you want to jump around, maybe take this video in a couple parts. And I'll probably link the slideshow as well. So if you just want to read through it, that's fine. Okay, so Star Economy and Chaos Galaxy TCG. Whoop. Is everything okay? Did something break? Okay, I think it's fine. Okay. Real basic thing to start off with is what are stars? So obviously stars are the resource system at the core of Chaos Galaxy TCG. Stars are pretty unique. There's some pretty defining characteristics of stars. So let's just talk about how they work. So at the beginning of the player's turn, they gain 4 stars. So when I start a turn, I gain 4 stars. When you start your turn, you gain 4 stars. Stars are cumulative, meaning that any stars left over at the end of your turn will carry over for use on future turns. If I end my turn with 4 stars, next turn when I gain stars, I will have 8 stars total. This is probably the most important thing that really defines Chaos Galaxy, I think, at least compared to other card games. You can never exceed 20 stars, so if you start your turn with 17 stars, you will only gain 3 instead of the usual 4. And then stars are generally used to buy zones, which is how you play cards. If you're not familiar with the Chaos Galaxy rules, there is a how-to play video in the description as well, so make sure to check that out. And then you also play creatures with them. Every creature has a star cost. And there are occasionally some resources and activator cards that also have star costs, but those are generally the exception and not the rule. So how are stars different from traditional resource systems? We're going to take a look at mainly how they compare to lands. I know I'm covering up part of this graph right here, but bear with me. Um, so how they compare to lands and here I'm actually gonna move my camera just a little wee bit just for this graph part, and I'll move back. Okay, so I'm mainly gonna compare to lands and like mana and stuff like that because that's the most common kind of resources in other card games. Obviously, there's different stuff like um, I'm blanking on examples right now. Obviously, Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't really have a traditional resource system like this. Legends of Runeterra has a system more common, more akin to Chaos Galaxy actually than Magic, I think. So there are going to be exceptions to this. Different games work differently, but generally, how things work is that in other card games is that you gain a land or mana at the beginning of your turn, and then you um, and that adds to like your total pool, right? So first turn you have 1 land, you can spend it. Second turn you have 2 lands, you can spend it, etc., etc. And that will, no matter what, follow this curve. So even if you spend all of your resources every single turn, it will end up like this. Now, obviously, that's not usually how people play games like this. It'll probably be more like this because you won't be able to spend every single resource on every single turn, and you might not want to spend every resource because maybe you want to save for counter spells or whatever. So it might look more like this, but generally in those games, this curve, this lower at the start, higher at the end kind of thing, is pretty much baked into the game. And this is for good reason. It creates a nice little curve. There are going to be less cards, and it's going to be like lower stakes at the beginning, and then the end game is going to have stronger cards, more cards being played, stuff like that. So this is a very interesting system, very cool system. There's a reason that a lot of games use this system. It's very tried and true. Now, in Gas Galaxy, if you spend all of your stars every turn, it's going to look like this. So you'll notice that at the beginning of the game, both players start with 4 stars, and they gain 8 stars at the beginning of their turn. This is mainly just to give you a boost for zones and stuff. And then if you spend all your stars every turn, you will never be able to play any card, any creature that costs more than 4 stars, because you literally just don't curve like that. So obviously, for various reasons, we don't play the game like this. First of all, it's hard to play a game like this unless you have a deck that is pretty much all 4-star creatures. It's gonna be hard to spend all of your stars every single turn. Um, and also because it's just not a good way to play the game. There's a lot of reasons why this is not a good strategy, which we're gonna go over later. So a more proper game of Chaos Galaxy is gonna be more like this. So obviously this is far more dynamic, and than the other graphs I looked at before, where your ramp and your curve and how the stars are is going to be really dependent on how you and your opponent play it, right? So yeah. So this is kind of how Chaos Galaxy works, and what makes it so interesting is this resource system, in my personal opinion. Or this makes the game interesting to me. Obviously, a lot of things about Chaos Galaxy makes the game interesting, but this is one of the main ones. So you can see, not only is there not like a strict enforced curve by the mechanics of the game, but also there's kind of this asymmetrical element that Chaos Galaxy has that other card games really don't. Where one person can have access to a lot more resources than the opposing person. Usually, this takes form and takes place in the form of like card advantage and stuff, which also exists in Chaos Galaxy. But there's also this kind of disparity and advantage as well. So, how do we use this knowledge of how Chaos Galaxy works, and what kind of techniques can we use to make sure that we take advantage of the system as much as possible? So, the number one thing, I think, a general rule of thumb, if you are brand new to the game. Oh, wait. I skipped a step? Oh my gosh, this is embarrassing. Okay, what is Star Economy? I forgot about this. So, Star Economy, we generally use it in two ways when you hear people talk about it. So, stars is the resource of the game, and star economy is how we manage the resources. So a player's star economy is how they manage their stars while playing. You'll hear people talk about people. You'll hear people talk about other people with good economy. People with good economy are able to use their resources in effective ways and um, plan out how they're going to spend their resources. Right? That's generally like good star economy, and they're also able to use the knowledge of their stars and their opponent's stars to effectively make decisions. Right? And then a player with bad star economy generally just plays cards, spends stars without much regard for future turns or how that affects the game state and whatnot. Now, we also talk about a deck's star economy sometime. So some decks have better star economy just because they have a easier time maintaining or generating stars. A really easy example of this is Sindel decks generally have really great star economy just because Sindel's ability is so strong. Whereas other decks may struggle. Whereas decks where have like decks that like require like lots of cost playing, generally a weaker economy. Um, like Shios generally had kind of bad economy was considered to have kind of bad economy for a long time. So people just like 4 stars in it. But yeah, star economy is probably the most important skill to develop as you're improving a CG. In my opinion, I think in other people's opinion, they would probably agree. It depends on format. There are different formats that care about star economy less. It's a little bit less important in this format, or it's like easier to get by without thinking about it, just because it's a little bit easier to do. Um, but having good star economy really helps you play the game, I think. And it'll also help your longevity in the game because I think it's just such a core part of the game. Anyway, so if you're trying to improve your star economy really fast, if you just want like one simple tip, don't go to 0. Going to 0 stars is pretty bad. If you end your turn on 0 stars, then that's going to really limit the amount of cards that you can play on the next turn, and that's just really bad. So if you want to go play Chaos Galaxy right now and just be better than you were yesterday, you just don't go to 0. That's like the very basic, simple tip that I can give you. We're going to go do a bunch of other stuff about how you don't go to 0 and how to effectively manage stars, but this is a really basic one. Okay, so let's talk about that. One of the main techniques that we use to make sure that we stay above 0 stars and to help our star economy is what I'm going to call ramping. So ramping is a term that comes from Magic the Gathering, I believe, and ramp cards in Magic are cards that allow you to have more mana. Now in Chaos Galaxy we have cards like this too, cards like Galaxy's Gift, cards like Rowdy, cards that just straight up generate new stars and give them to you, and those are good for economy even if they have other weaknesses and stuff. But there's another way to ramp in Chaos Galaxy that you can't really do in other card games, and that is just saving stars. Um, so obviously on any turn you can play a 1, 2, 3, or 4-star creature, but if you want to play a 5, 6, 7, or 8-star creature, you're going to have stars saved from a previous turn. So when we hear people talk about ramping, they're generally talking about like playing small creatures that you save stars, or playing small creatures, or just passing turns that you save stars for future turns. You might hear some people talk about categorizing cards based on how many stars they allow us to save. So, for example, if you have a 3-star creature, that gives us +1 in economy, right? Because it basically allows us to have 1 star in our reserve for future turns. And then, contrary to that, you might have a 6-star creature. People might say it leaves us -2 in economy because it dips into our savings a little bit. So this is really helpful for not only when you're playing, but also your deck building. Because it will help you, it just helps you think about what you're playing this turn and what you're gonna be able to play next turn when you think about it in this way. Spending no stars leaves us +4 economy, which is probably the best way to instantly ramp into everything. If you pass one turn, you immediately are able to play any card in the game, basically. Besides Chaos Beast and Omnius, obviously, but yeah. Because most creatures are either 1 through 8 stars. So yeah. Basically every deck in the game has had like really good ramping tools. If we look way back, then Atatrox is incredibly good and made that deck really good. Made early Barrow decks really good because it like not only is it a 3-star, so it's +1 in economy, but it also generally allows you to pass more turns because it lives so long. So it's really easy way to save up stars. If you look at Galactic Divide and the Ozo decks, we'll see Thornborg in those, which allow you to ramp into cards in your deck really well. If you look at now, cards like Field, Rowdy, Duple, these cards that allow you to spend either no stars or very little stars on your turn are super effective and help Pally kind of dominate the format in a lot of ways. So having good ramping tools that allow you to save stars is very, very, very important in this game. And you should definitely think about it when you are deck building and also when you're playing and thinking about how you're using different cards. So as an example, I'm just going to talk about Thunderborg for a second. I can move my camera background. I'm gonna sorry Thunderborg. It's okay. So obviously Thunderborg, pretty common card. It's fallen out of favor a little bit, but it was really, really common starting with Galactic Divide Ozo decks. And there are a couple of reasons it was really common. First of all, it has a great draw effect. Like undeniably, being able to draw one card when it dies, it's just really good for your card advantage, obviously. And then it's a 1-star creature, meaning it's +3 in economy. Now, +3 in economy is good because it allows you to save a lot of stars, but it's also really important for the Ozo decks because they have really strong 7-star creatures. So Ozo and Pelfam, who are 2 really strong creatures in that format, you were able to quickly play them if you had Thunderborg because Thunderborg went into it really easily. Yeah, so like if you had so for example, like if you had other creatures, if you played like a different creature on that turn, like you played a random creature like Nature Knight, whatever, like that card doesn't help you get to Ozone and Pelfam faster. Like if you have 0 stars, it'll take you 2 turns to get to Ozone and Pelfam. If you play Nature Knight, it will still take you it would take you 2 turns after that one. But if you pass or play a 1-star like Thornborg, then you still get it in 2 turns, if that makes sense. So basically, by having cards that ramp into your strong creatures, you're able to create a curve so that you're able to access those creatures as fast as possible without having to pass every turn. Now, passing is a very important tool and it should be used at certain points. But when we don't have to pass, it can be really nice. Thornborg's really good because here I'll actually run you through an example. So here's an example. Let's say our opponent has a Crantron, big threat. We have to deal with Crantron pretty much immediately because we can't let our opponent bring out, just get 5-3 points. That's really bad. In our hand, we have Thornborg, Pelfam, Orbov. Obviously, Thornborg and Orbov don't answer Crantron immediately, so we can't. So we don't have an answer. And Pelfam we can't play this turn because we only have 4 stars, so we don't have an answer this turn. However, we want an answer to this Crantron as soon as possible because it's really threatening, and our opponent's gonna be gaining stars again. so they could have more threats behind this Crantron. So we can't play Pelfam, so we basically have three options. We can pass, we can Orbob, we can Thornborg. Passing's bad because they get 5 3 points. Orbob is okay. Orbob's a great chump blocker. You could play it, and then it'll chump block this Crantron, and hopefully you draw an answer next turn. And Orbob can defend another attack if need be later on. Or you can play Thornborg, and Thornborg is going to block this attack, and he's going to draw us a card, which will dig for another answer, and then most importantly, since we only spent 1 star, we'll have 7 the next turn, so we can immediately play Pelfam. So Thornborg is the best play here, because not only does it help us dig, but it also gives us an immediate answer to our opponent's board. So this is like a very simplified example of kind of how we can use ramping as like a tool to make sure that we get immediate answers without allowing our opponent to get free points and stuff like that. So it's really important to think about this when you're playing and how your current actions are going to affect not only your actions for the next turn, but also the turns after that and so on. Thinking about star economy in this kind of ramp-like fashion where you have a certain amount of stars and you want to get to higher amounts of stars so you have answers in situations like this is just like really beneficial, I think. Now, so this is the deck building side, designing curves. Knowing how your deck ramps into those bigger creatures is really important. So if you didn't have a small creature like Thornborg in that situation, you literally wouldn't be able to play your Pelfam, right? Which means you just wouldn't have options for those situations. So having those low-end options is pretty important. Having options that allow you to curve in. So knowing what those options are is really important when you're building the deck, and it's important when you're playing, because you want to use those options like, well. For example, if you have a deck with a lot of strong 6 stars, you're going to want cards that are 1 star or 2 star, so that you always have like a chump blocker that immediately ramps into it when you're at low stars. Or some other card like Adatrox or FaceTime that gives you multiple turns to ramp into that card. If your deck has a lot of 8 stars, obviously you aren't going to be able to ramp into it directly with creatures generally, besides like Fraxel, and you're not going to be able to ramp into it directly with creatures besides like Fraxel. So you're going to want cards that allow you to pass turns. So cards like Adatrox, FaceTime again. Cards like Planetary Field is very good for this, obviously. So stuff like that is really important if you have a deck built around 8 stars. Really important in this format because of Polysium, right? And then it also matters thinking about if you need to build wider for your decks. So some decks are more reliant on second and third zones, so you also have to think about how you can ramp into those if you plan to rely on them in your game plan. Okay, so that's kind of that ramping part. That is a very important part. I think most people have some kind of intrinsic understanding of it. It's pretty intuitive when you're playing, but I think it's important to put that into words, just in case some people like don't quite understand it or don't have the words to kind of describe it. Okay, I feel like I'm getting kind of rambly, but that's okay, right? It's fine, right? Okay, we're gonna talk about star advantage. The star advantage, because the amount of stars you have is generally a result of the stars you spent on your previous turns, it's common for both players to have different amounts of stars. In other games, on the 5th turn, it might be common for player 1 to start their turn with 5 mana or whatever, and player 2 to also start their turn with 5. But in CG, it can be pretty common where one person starts their turn with 12 and the other person starts their turn with 4, depending on how the game goes. The person who has more stars is considered to have star advantage, and then the other person is considered to be disadvantaged, I suppose. And then generally this is going to be the player who goes first just because they gain stars first. So on the first turn they'll have 8 to their opponent's 4, and then the opponent will start their turn and they might have star advantage on their turn, but then when it goes back the opponent will have star advantage, stuff like that. So generally when you go first, you will have star advantage. That's the advantage to going first. But that can and likely will change over the course of the game, just because there's so many stars being spent and all that. So having a star advantage is good because it limits the amount of options your opponent has and also increases the amount of options you have. If you have more stars, you can play more cards, and if your opponent has less stars, they can play less cards. So it's really important to try to be maintaining star advantage, because you don't want to be in a situation where you don't have a lot of stars to work with and your opponent has a ton of stars to work with. That could be a really, really dangerous situation to be in. It's gonna, yeah, it fully covers this. Okay, we go back here for a second. Look, imagine I'm down here. Okay, so star advantage generally matters more the lower the disadvantaged player's star count is. So if I have 8 stars and my opponent has 2 stars, I will have some options to work with, and my opponent will basically have no options to work with, right? But if I'm at 18 stars, my opponent is at 12 stars, the star gap is still 6 stars, but we both have so many stars that we both have a lot of options to work with. There probably isn't any creature in our deck that one of us can't play. We'll probably be able to play any card in our hand if we want to. So that's something to keep in mind, is that star advantage matters, but star count is also very important. I think I'm going myself back this. Yeah, okay. So star count is something that I made up for this slideshow. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say this, but it sounds a lot more nice than saying high stars and low stars. High star count, low star count just sounds nicer to me. But it's basically just the number of stars a player has. Generally, what I'd consider a low star count is anything below 8 stars. When you have less than 8 stars, you're going to be actively limited in the amount of cards you can play and the types of cards you can play. So this isn't true for every deck, obviously. Some decks don't run a card that's higher than 7 stars, but this is just a general rule of thumb that the star counts are generally considered lower. My throat's so dry, but I'm having water. Anyway, so yeah, obviously it doesn't matter as much. Like if you're playing Gaios, then probably all your creatures are 3 stars anyway, but you're still going to be limited in the sense that you won't be able to play as many creatures, right? So yeah, and then high star count I generally consider something that's like 12 or above. When you're at 12 or above, you can basically play any creature without affecting your options on the next turn. So if you have 12, you spend 8 on a Cranchon. I use Cranchon for every example, but that's okay. You spend 8 on a Cranchon, and you start your next turn, you'll have 8 again, just because you had 4 left over from last turn. So 12 is a really safe place to be for most decks, and then below 8 can be kind of dangerous depending on what your deck is. And like I said, different decks are going to prioritize different star counts. Smaller creature decks are going to not really need higher stars as often. Big creature decks really care about being at a big, safe star count. So it's just going to depend on matchups, deck conditions, stuff like that. So that's star advantage and star count. How can we use that to inform so we can use those things to inform how the state of the game is and how we should play. Now, the thing about star advantage and star count is that they are variables that you should be taking into account when you are playing, but they are definitely not the end all be all. Things like win conditions, matchups, card advantage, state of the game, whether it's early game, late game, mid game, your hand, obviously. Like these are things that are what resources have been expended, what resources haven't been expended, the board state. These are all things that definitely matter a lot, right? So stars are only like one piece of that puzzle, and you shouldn't. I'm about to like make suggestions depending on, like, I'm gonna try to describe the dynamics of different star counts, but it's definitely not an end all be all. It's just like a light little grain of salt suggestion, okay? So don't take it too seriously. But yeah, so generally the player with star advantage can play threats and either force their opponent to fall to low star counts if they aren't at low star counts, or remain at low star counts if they are at low star counts, or use valuable resources like phantom matter, or field or whatever to try to get themselves out of that situation. So when you're at star advantage, being able to take advantage of your advantage and capitalize on it and force your opponent to respond to what you're doing and use resources that they want for later is very important. This doesn't mean you should always be aggressive when you have any star advantage, but it is just like a thing that exists. It's easier to be more aggressive and get resources out of your opponent when you have star advantage. So the player at disadvantage is generally going to want to play in a way that allows them to recuperate stars, or at the very least ramp into a higher star count so they have more options to work with. So you'll see players at disadvantage, they'll commonly pass if they can, they will play small creatures if they can, stuff like that. That allows them to get to higher star counts so that they have a better way to deal with the situation. Um, so they have a better way to deal with the situation. Yeah, kind of like in the example we talked about earlier, where we played, we're at we actually were at star advantage in that situation, but we played longer barks so we could recuperate stars and get ourselves in a better position, right? Stuff like that. Now, how does star count? So star count also affects this. If we're at star advantage, and so when both players, so star advantage is like one piece of the puzzle, right? If I'm at star advantage and it's like a slight star advantage, it matters, but it doesn't matter as much as if I have like a big star advantage. Star count is like more uniformly applicable, I think, because like when both players have high star counts, the state of the game is just a certain way, um, or at least like the potential state of the game is a certain way, even if the advantage, no matter what way the advantage swings, right? Because if both people have high star counts, both players are going to have a lot of potential like threats to play, and they're also going to have a lot of potential, like really big potential punishes. So these are like really important parts of the game because the potential damage that a player could take is really big. Like they could take 5-point swings, 8-point swings, all that crazy stuff. And this does depend on the deck. Some decks need more stars for their bursts, some need less stars but more cards. But generally, these, when both players have a lot of resources, um, a lot of stars, or a lot of cards also, those are going to be potentially more volatile and impactful game states if you don't like play them right. So it's very important, I think, when both players have high strike counts, it's like really important to play carefully. You don't want to play. You don't obviously don't want to overextend because your opponent could punish you very badly, but you also don't want to play too passively because your opponent could overwhelm you, right? So those are very important parts of the game to play well. When the star count is lower, the potential threats are limited. Now it doesn't since like the potential damage you're gonna take when both players are at 4 stars is like very minor. So what both players are generally trying to do in that situation is they're trying to gain stars so they have a more threatening star count and they have a more threatening like resources in their hand, while also trying to force their opponent to spend their stars. So a very good example of this is like Atatrox. Um, it is a card that ramps really incredibly well, but it also threatens your opponent with like a decent enough amount of damage that they kind of have to answer it. So if you're playing Atatrox and you swing for 2, and they play like a 4-star to respond, then they're wasting stars trying to kill your Atatrox while you're ramping up. So that's like a really ideal scenario when the star count is low for both players. So both players are going to be trying to ramp their own stars up, while also trying to make sure their opponent doesn't get too. Also trying to maintain star advantage and create a gap against their opponent. Is generally how I think you should probably play star economy when stars are low. And obviously, when there's a big disparity, one player is going to have a big advantage over the opponent generally. One player will be able to freely play kind of whatever cards they want, and the other player is going to be struggling because they won't have all the answers that they want. And that doesn't mean you should overextend like super hard when you have more stars than your opponent. Like if you have 20 stars and your opponent has 4 stars, like it doesn't mean you should play every creature in your hand and attack for as many points as possible. Because you can still get punished. The punish won't be as big, obviously, because they don't have as many stars to work with. But you don't want to you never want to overextend like that. It's just bad. But it does mean that you are able to more freely pressure your opponent, while your opponent is trying to navigate out of that game state and try to get to a place where they have more stars to work with, more resources to work with. And obviously, on the flip side, if you're disadvantaged by a lot, then you want to get to a game state where you're able to more freely play cards again. Now, that's basically everything I want to talk about. There's one last thing that I want to tack in on the end here because I think it kind of matters in Star Economy, but it's kind of minor and doesn't matter that much. And you're gonna hear people talk about it a lot because it's funny. But we're talking about leaking. Leaking is when You are unable to gain the full 4 stars at the beginning of your turn because it would exceed the 20-star cap. So this is bad. Generally, it's bad, but there are places you generally don't want to do this. Don't do this. The reason you don't want to do this is because you're going to be missing out on potential resources. If you end your turn on 20 stars, not 40, 20 stars, that is 4 stars that you are not going to gain next turn. So if you had spent 4 stars that turn on like another zone or something, then you in both scenarios you end up with the same amount of stars at the beginning of your turn, 20, but in one scenario you'll end with an extra zone. So generally you don't want to leave because you're wasting potential resources, just like I said. Rule of thumb: end your turn with 16 stars or less. Now there is situations where you don't want to do this. They're pretty niche, but they do come up, and you should think about them. So like if I have 20 stars and my opponent has, if I have 20 stars and I have 2 resource zones, 2 battle zones, 2 creature zones, and my opponent has like 16 stars or whatever, I could buy another zone to get below 16, but it would take me all the way down to 12. So and then my opponent would be 20 to 12, right? So there are situations where you kind of have to weigh those kind of different values. Is it that important that you stay on pace with your opponent's economy? How much value does that third zone actually get you? Like these are the kinds of things you kind of think about in those scenarios. So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind when you are getting those league scenarios. Generally stay below 16, but there might be situations where maybe there's a certain answer that you want to have in your back pocket, but if you go to 12, you won't be able to play it on your next turn. So yeah, thanks for watching. I don't know how long that was. It was like 30 minutes. 30 minutes. I hope that wasn't too rambly. I hope everybody got something out of that. It was definitely helpful for me to write that all down and like think about how I think about star economy and how it affects how I play. I think this is a really important part of Chaos Galaxy that makes it unique and very fun. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I'm probably want to make more of these. I'm trying to think of more topics that are kind of unique to Chaos Galaxy. Because there's stuff that we could talk about, like we could talk about card advantage, but that's like kind of boring because that's every card game. I might talk about stats in Chaos Galaxy because I think that's how stats work in this game is like pretty interesting, and it can be hard to tell like what is good stats, what is bad stats. So yeah, obviously, if you want to see more of these, make sure to let me know in the comments. Like if you like, subscribe if you want to see more Chaos Galaxy content. Yeah. Discord link in the description below. Other content creators in the description below. Timestamps if you want to go rewatch certain parts of the video. And that's all. See ya.